Sportsnight tonight includes highlights of England's important match against Spain in Madrid. Sportsnight is at 10:10. And in half an hour, QED takes a tongue-in-cheek look at the origins of the human race, including Kenny Everett. That's at 9:35 on BBC1.
The 9 o'clock news from the BBC with Julia Somerville and Andrew Harvey.
The Leyland truck business is to be sold abroad to the Dutch firm DAF.
Environment Secretary Nicholas Ridley puts off the privatisation of council services.
Counting continues in the Irish election with Charles Haughey set for victory.
The President says Chief of Staff Donald Regan is free to leave if he wants.
And a special report on meningitis. There could be twice as many cases as we thought. Good evening. BBC Television News has learnt tonight that Leyland Trucks is to be sold abroad to the Dutch company DAF. The Cabinet will be briefed tomorrow and asked to endorse the merger. Leyland Trucks has been losing millions and the search for a foreign buyer has been going on for some time. The deal is likely to mean cutbacks at Scammell in Watford as well as in Leyland, with about 2,000 jobs affected. Tonight's news seems set to stir up a political storm. Labour says the sale will be bad for Britain. The Alliance says it means the liquidation of Leyland Trucks.
It's nearly a year since Industry Minister Paul Channon backed down in a political row and announced the end of a deal to sell loss-making Leyland vehicles and Land Rover to the world's biggest motor company, the American General Motors. Since then, he's given undertakings that Land Rover will not be sold. But the problem of Leyland Trucks has remained. It's estimated to be losing £1 million a week, although its trucks lead the British market. So the government's been desperate to find someone to take it over. Tomorrow, the Cabinet will be told that the recommendation is for a merger with DAF, the Dutch company which already markets smaller Leyland trucks on the continent. But the signs are there'll be another political row. The Alliance employment spokesman, Malcolm Bruce, has said it'll mean the loss of thousands of jobs over 5 years. Tonight, Labour's John Smith said this.
You may have to collaborate with other people in the way that Rover Group has done with Honda, and we've never been against sensible collaboration between equals. But if it amounts to a sell-off of Leyland Trucks, it's a very serious business. And if every business that's making temporary losses has to be sold off, there would be no economic future for this country. The policy ought to be to keep it British and to support it through to success.
But the car division is likely to gain, as the Cabinet sugars the pill by giving the extra funds which Mr Day wants for Austin Rover. That's been losing money and sales, although this year it started well. It needs the money for its new models and a proposed new engine. And help to the Midlands car plants will please the strong Midlands lobby who forced the Land Rover climb down last year.
Martin Adeney on the controversial issue that the Cabinet will be discussing in the morning.
The government has shelved plans for more privatisation of council services, but the Environment Secretary Nicholas Ridley insisted the delay was only temporary, and it brought criticism from his own backbenchers. Mr Ridley's measures would have included more competition in council services, as well as ending political influence on council contracts, and a proposal to stop political advertising on the rates.
At the Conservative Party conference, Mr Ridley's commitment was clear to banning propaganda on the rates and to greater competition for providing council services. 4 months ago, the message to Conservatives seemed clear.
We will introduce legislation very soon.
Then in November, in the Queen's speech, the government reiterated their commitment.
My government will continue to seek better value for money in public spending so that vital services may be further improved.
And as recently as a fortnight ago, Christopher Chope, one of Mr Ridley's junior ministers, once more confirmed the government's intentions. More than 140 councils have already put some of their services, like refuse collections, out to tender. The government insists it saves money, but compulsion to do so is controversial. At Westminster, the opposition promised a fierce battle and some late nights. And this year, the government has already found itself forced to introduce 2 local government bills. A third is promised next month, but now without its most controversial proposals.
We came upon a bit of bad luck in the need to change the whole legal basis of rate support grant, which we discovered just before Christmas time, and we had to put that right, and that took up an awful lot of time and effort, and the cause of that was that the clauses we're talking about today got late and are now too late.
The reality is they're frightened of the electoral consequences of policies which would threaten hundreds of thousands of jobs in local government and damage the Tories' position electorally.
For the alliance, Michael Meadowcroft blamed the government's lack of competence. Less than jubilant Conservatives like John Heddle expected widespread disappointment, and Keith Hampson found it hard to believe if there was a will, there wasn't a way. A succession of Environment Secretaries, of whom Mr Ridley is the latest, have discovered the pitfalls of handling local government. It's complex, and the jobs already tarnish several political reputations. Not all Conservative-run councils have rushed towards privatisation either. Today's announcement is a substantial setback for a policy commitment that had 2 especially fervent supporters, Mr Ridley and Mrs Thatcher.
David Davis. Counting is still going on in the Irish election, and it looks as if the result will be very close. The opposition leader Charles Haughey seems most likely to be able to form a government, but it's not clear whether he has enough support for an overall majority. There was a record turnout for the election, which it's thought has helped Mr Haughey's Fianna Fáil party. But Dr Garret FitzGerald has not yet conceded defeat. His party, Fine Gael, has suffered significant losses to the new third force in Irish politics, the Progressive Democrats, led by Desmond O'Malley. Counting takes a long time because the Irish voting system involves a complicated system of proportional representation. There are 41 constituencies. Between 3 and 5 members are elected in each one. Voters put each candidate in order of preference, and a candidate has to reach a minimum quota of votes to be elected. After that, second or third choices are counted instead. The final result won't be declared until tomorrow, but John Simpson in Dublin has the latest details.
Well, we're getting now to the stage where Irish elections are won or lost. That's to say, the last stages of the count, when the last few people get under the kind of level of choice, and the last seats are allocated. And so that's the area that we're in at the moment. We're waiting for this. We're waiting to find out whether Mr Haughey is in fact going to get his majority, or whether he's just simply going to have to govern with the support of a few independent MPs, something he really doesn't want to do. Let's start off, though, by looking at the count today and looking at the way in which the various politicians have reacted.
Charles J. Haughey, leader of Fianna Fáil, the boss to his supporters, is already being feted like a Prime Minister-elect. The trend against the FitzGerald government was clear from the start of the count, although the target of an overall majority remains debatable.
There's a great swing towards Fianna Fáil, and the thing now is that to translate that swing into seats in the final stages, and we're quite happy that we're well on the way towards our overall majority.
As the seats gradually accumulated, Mr Haughey was questioned about British apprehension to his victory.
I never thought the English were a very apprehensive people.
But
what about hearts of oak and all that sort of thing?
But what would you say to the people, maybe in Northern Ireland as well, who are also concerned?
I have been Taoiseach in this country before and had quite satisfactory Anglo-Irish relations. No great problem.
For Dr FitzGerald, every election bulletin piled on the news of defeat. The same for his former Labour coalition partner. The seepage of votes was being clawed in by the newly created radical right Progressive Democrats.
I don't know, we'll really have to wait and see, but it looks as if we'll win something in the region of 14, 15, 16, somewhere like that. And I think that's a fantastic achievement for a party that quite literally did not exist less than 14 months ago.
A little comfort came Fine Gael's way with a thumping victory in a country constituency in County Kerry. And tonight, Dr FitzGerald managed a resolute smile as he left party headquarters in Dublin. With transferred preference votes to be totalled through the night, the possibility of a hung parliament still remains. Then the political horse trading would have to begin. But for Mr Haughey, the prospect of power is tantalisingly close. After years in the opposition wilderness, the Irish Republic appears to have voted him back.
From the British point of view, this election is important for two reasons. The first is economic. The Republic's economy is in serious trouble, and the way the new government here deals with the problem will affect us and the rest of the European community to some extent. The second reason is the future of the Anglo-Irish agreement, of course. Mr. Harvey was fairly soothing about it just now, but he hasn't always taken that line, as James Robbins reports.
In 1980, when Mr. Harvey and Mrs. Thatcher initiated a new process of Anglo-Irish understanding, he was not expecting the outcome eventually agreed with his successor. 5 years later, the Anglo-Irish agreement enshrined cross-border cooperation and joint consultation between civil servants, all consistent with the Harvey approach. What was not, Mr. Harvey protests, came in the opening words of the agreement, the entrenched guarantee to Northern Unionists. The two governments affirm that any change in the status of Northern Ireland would only come about with the consent of a majority of the people of Northern Ireland. That international commitment has dogged Mr. Harvey throughout the election campaign, first saying he would change it, undermining the treaty as a whole, then in his television debate with Garret FitzGerald, forced to withdraw the threat. But what would Mr. Harvey do in power again? Risk the progress his nationalist allies in Northern Ireland have hailed, like Seamus Mallon of the SDLP, or do what his unionist enemies like Ken McGuinness have failed to achieve by protest and boycott, destroy the agreement?
If he's an honourable man at all, he will clarify his position on that. Now, I think we all know what that position is. I think it will dissuade Mrs. Thatcher and her government from believing that there is any change in the attitude of Republicans in ERA to the status of Northern Ireland, as she has tried to convince us there is.
I have no doubt whatsoever that the agreement will remain. It is an agreement between two countries, not between two people or between two governments even. And I think Mr. Harvey would be the first to realise that one of the results of this election is that there is a consensus in favour of the agreement among the political parties in the Republic of Ireland.
Tonight, the Northern Ireland office and ministers in London are withholding any comment about future relations with Dublin until the new government is finally chosen.
Well, John Simpson in Dublin, if Charles Harvey does win, as seems likely, is it the end of the Anglo-Irish agreement, as some people seem to think?
Certainly not in the first stages, no question about that. Mr. Harvey is a consummate politician, and he knows perfectly well that any Irish Prime Minister has to have reasonably good relations over a long period of time with any British Prime Minister, no matter what their individual differences are. And there's another thing, the Anglo-Irish agreement is anyway mostly nowadays run between, we'll say, officials on either side of the border and maybe even chief superintendents of the police forces on either side of the border. But what will be in question is the enthusiasm or lack of it with which Mr. Harvey goes about the problems of taking the more difficult decisions, like extraditing people to Northern Ireland and so forth. That could be a big problem, and of course the mere fact of his being in government is also going to be a problem for the agreement.
It's a tremendous political comeback, isn't it? 4 years ago when he lost the election, people really almost wrote him off. Are they surprised at the way he's bounced back like this?
Well, you see, there's not really any real alternative. 4 years ago, when Dr. Garret FitzGerald was elected Prime Minister, people put an enormous amount of trust in him. He was regarded as the most intelligent politician in Ireland. He was regarded as the man who had the key, the answer to all the economic problems. And he failed, frankly. His coalition partners no doubt helped him to fail. It wasn't possible for him to make the kind of cuts in spending that he knew he had to make. But nevertheless, as far as an awful lot of people here are concerned, at any rate, he's let them down. There's only one other person with the kind of confidence that they could turn to. That was Mr. Harvey.
John Simpson, thank you very much.
The number of cases of meningitis in England and Wales could be double the official figure. The government is considering new measures to help save the lives of children who catch the disease. One way may be for the Department of Health to make it compulsory for doctors to report new cases.
Clever boy. Now hit the centre, hit the centre.
Simone Matthews can't treat her son Thomas as an ordinary little boy. He's been on penicillin since birth and mustn't mix with other children. It's much too dangerous. Mrs. Matthews' first two children died after contracting the same complaint, meningitis. Thomas is fine and healthy, but the disease has shattered her life.
Well, I call it a monster, because it is like a monster just taking over a body. It's evil, you know, and it's to see a little baby be so distorted and bruised, and it's awful, and you can't do anything about it. That's the worst thing, you know.
Mrs. Matthews isn't alone. The people of Stroud have been panicked by an outbreak of meningitis in their town. It's been seen as a mini epidemic. But a leading authority now says the disease is much more widespread than official figures show.
There is no doubt that there is underreporting, and I think it's extremely variable. But one has to concede, I think, that it may be up to half, and possibly in some instances more than half of the cases.
There are several reasons for this. Not all forms of meningitis have to be reported, but Professor Moxon's research shows that doctors themselves aren't filling in forms telling the authorities they've dealt with a meningitis case. Britain's biggest city councils are studying a report from the London Borough of Hounslow showing that only 40% of family doctors in this area are making any reports at all on notifiable infectious diseases, including meningitis.
A child comes in with meningitis and maybe dies. Here, a doctor is confronted with a tragic situation with all of its immediate consequences, the grief of parents. And at the time, it must seem a rather trivial exercise to be notifying a disease.
If meningitis is caught quickly, children can and do recover. Claire Smith was one of the lucky ones. But if others like her are to survive, those seeking a complete answer to a baffling and devastating disease must know the exact number of cases and the strain of bacteria involved. Tonight's move by the government is aimed at giving them the facts to conquer a disease hitting hundreds of children each year.
John Fryer reporting. 2 British soccer fans have been stabbed during a fight with rival Spanish supporters. The incident happened before tonight's international between Spain and England. Police said fighting began when a bus carrying British fans was stoned as it pulled up outside the Madrid stadium. Both youths were taken to hospital, where one is said to be in a serious condition. Earlier, 12 England supporters were arrested after scuffles on a train taking them to Madrid. And in a separate incident, 6 other youths were detained. The match is still going on.
The government has made it clear it's determined to go ahead with the deportation of 58 Tamils who arrived in Britain last Friday. But by tonight, the Home Office still hadn't challenged the High Court injunction, which last night stopped them being sent home. The Tamils claim they're political refugees from the civil war in Sri Lanka. The government says that's nonsense, and they're in fact victims of an organised immigration racket.
While their fate's decided, the Tamils are being held in detention. More details about their background emerged during questioning this afternoon by lawyers from the UK Immigrants Advisory Service, who last night were successfully applying to the High Court, while the Tamils themselves were resorting to desperate measures at Heathrow to delay the deportations. From Sri Lanka, they travelled to Malaysia, where they're said to have paid £1,500 to a middleman for forged papers and tickets, travelling via Bangladesh to Britain. One MP described them in the Commons as poor dupes, the latest victims of the racketeering, which has led to over 300 Tamils arriving in Britain without proper papers in the last 2 months. Last summer's Atlantic crossing by over 150 Tamils from Germany seeking asylum in Canada showed the lengths to which some are prepared to go. Today, the Home Office has been sticking to its view the latest group are not proper refugees, and it's a European problem.
The Germans, the Danes, the Swedes, 3 countries noted for their liberality, have all been forced in recent weeks and months to make a change in their own policies because they too have been subject to this kind of abuse, this kind of dodge.
The fact that they weren't able to get the proper documentation, the proper visas, doesn't relate to the quality of their application to be considered a refugee.
Indeed, he argues it adds weight to the Tamils' claims. The British Refugee Council has also accused the government of changing the rules over asylum seekers' right of appeal. Both sides will be back in the courts, probably on Monday, and the legal wrangles could stretch on for weeks.
A poll in tomorrow's Daily Telegraph puts the Conservatives just 1.5 points ahead of Labour. The poll by Gallup was conducted across the country, but another one in today's Times, which was based on marginal constituencies, gives the Conservatives a comfortable lead. Our political editor John Cole explains why the figures are so different.
Gallup, the latest opinion poll in tomorrow's Daily Telegraph, shows Conservatives and Labour too close together for Mrs Thatcher to call an early election, particularly since the Alliance are catching up fast. Gallup's been seesawing recently, but now the Conservatives are shown with 36% support, Labour with 34.5% and the Alliance with 27.5%. 8.5% are still undecided. That's a nationwide poll, of course, but pollsters have begun to concentrate more on Conservative-held marginals, where they say the election will be won or lost. Morey have taken the latest of these for the Times. The results from just 73 marginals would give the Tories an overall majority of 94. Which kind of poll is better?
For the purpose of predicting the next election, it's the poll in the marginals that is superior to the national poll, because it's in the marginal seats that the next election is going to be won or lost. The reason for the difference between these two polls, I think, is that Labour is pushing up its vote most in its own safe seats, where it doesn't really need any extra votes. It's pushing up its vote in safe Labour areas, working class areas. What it needs to do, though, is to do well in the marginal seats, and there it's failing to push up its vote as much. Now, in terms of the next election result, what this means is that there'll not be a hung parliament, if the polls continue as they are at the moment. Instead, if opinion continues as it is at the moment, there's going to be a substantial Conservative majority of perhaps 90 plus.
Needless to say, the politicians wouldn't all agree. Labour argues that polling in individual marginals gives them a better result, and that anyhow, ahead of an election, many people don't even realise they're in a marginal. The Alliance say they're not discouraged either. In Liberal or SDP marginals, there's what they call a margin for conversion. They always have to win people over during the campaign. The Conservatives are quietly encouraged, hoping this shows people will give them votes in the places where they really need them.
President Reagan has added to speculation in Washington that Donald Regan, his chief of staff, may soon leave the White House. Answering reporters' questions before meeting the Israeli Prime Minister, the president denied Mr. Regan was about to be fired, but said his future was up to him.
A lot of commotion when an Israeli Prime Minister comes visiting, and Israeli Prime Ministers come visiting here more than any other heads of government. But this was the first such meeting since the Iranian arms deal, which White House documents claimed was initiated by Israel. Also, Mr. Shamir was here amid reports of yet another shake-up in the senior White House staff, and at a time when the president's seclusion was ending, the first time this year that photographers and reporters have been let into the Oval Office. But he wouldn't take their questions about the scandal.
I'm not going to take any questions on that situation until the Tower Commission's report is turned in to us.
The other question was about Chief of Staff Donald Regan. He and the First Lady were reported not to be on speaking terms, and asked if he were leaving, the President gave him a less-than-ringing endorsement.
Well, this is up to him. I have always said that when the people that I've asked to come into government feel that they have to return to private life, that's their business, and I will never try to talk them out of it.
The two leaders spent 2 hours together, and when they finished, the Chief of Staff was still there. But his hold on office is tenuous, and Mr. Reagan, in his closing statement, made a passing reference to the scandal that won't go away.
Prime Minister Shamir and I discussed Iran. I underscored our opposition to Iran's use of force, terrorism, and expansionism. In discussing Iran and other regional issues, the Prime Minister and I agreed on the importance of looking to the future instead of dwelling on the past.
The Prime Minister left amid more questions. Was the Chief of Staff staying or going? The President motioned to Mr. Regan to answer. Each now says it's up to the other, which doesn't sound like the formula for 2 more years together. This is Martin Bell for the 9 o'clock news at the White House.
A new campaign to help Britain's homeless people was launched today. Social workers and voluntary helpers from all over the country met in London to discuss ways to help the thousands who sleep rough every night.
1 a.m. and emergency aid arrives. But this is not Ethiopia or Mozambique.
It's London, 1987, less than half a mile from Parliament.
Right, now let some other people get some eggs, okay? Shirts.
Some passers-by seem quite unperturbed. Others stare in disbelief as the street people crowd round the van, hands outstretched to claim blankets and clothes that will help keep some of them alive. The younger ones climb back into their cardboard boxes for the night. The older ones sleep upright. The pavement, they say, is much too cold. Scores spend every night this way. Even when the odd hostel bed becomes available, many are too frightened to take up the offer.
Some places you go, you get that many drunks, you get fights every night. You don't need that neither. But there's loads of houses empty. Councils just don't want to know them.
As Andy was speaking to us, one young woman, an alcoholic and drug addict, was crying out in agony. An ambulance was summoned. One London police inspector is so shocked at what's going on, he's turned the job of helping these people into something of a personal crusade.
I mean, you can see that this is just like an open hospital ward. The people who are lying in their beds on the side, on the street. The ideal thing would, of course, be able to clear this street of people which wouldn't have to stay here. They wouldn't have to rest on the pavements like this. The trouble is, it's like a bucket. Holes in it. Each time you keep pouring the water and it keeps pouring out of the bottom.
Today, the inspector opened his police station to all those seeking to find an answer to the problem. All of them know that for some who are already back on the streets tonight, time could be fast running out.
Bill Hamilton reporting. And the main news tonight, the British company Leyland Trucks is to be sold abroad. The buyer is the Dutch firm DAF. That's the national and international news tonight. Good night.
Good night.
Good evening. Now here's the news in the southeast. 5 skinheads who attacked an Asian family in Dunstable have been jailed for a total of 27 years for a fray. Luton Crown Court heard the family of 14 were ambushed, punched and kicked as they left a restaurant. The judge said the gang's only motive was racial hatred. A London hospital has confirmed that a man with AIDS wasn't told of his condition for almost 3 months. Simon Hayward from Brixton went to St James's Hospital in Balham for a test in October. He says he was told in December that he was all clear and only learned he did have AIDS when he went back for a checkup 2 days ago. The hospital denies there's been a blunder but is reviewing its policy on AIDS test results. Scotland Yard's fraud squad is investigating the way in which up to £500,000 worth of public money has been spent in Hackney. The investigation involves a community centre run by the Hackney Asian Association and funds distributed by Hackney Council. Council leader Andrew Puddyfat says despite 2 investigations, the council found no concrete evidence that anything was wrong. Student leaders at Oxford University are tonight considering withdrawing an invitation to Sinn Féin President Gerry Adams. He'd been invited to address a debate on Ireland, but the 2 main speakers have withdrawn in protest. A 39-year-old man has died after a Citroën car crashed into a police car on the M4 near Slough. It happened between junctions 8 and 9 on the eastbound carriageway. The 6 Alsatian puppies found dumped in a briefcase in a roadside ditch near Newbury have all been found new homes by the RSPCA. The organisation is trying to bring a private prosecution against the man alleged to have abandoned them. And the town crier in the London borough of Lambeth will be making a bit more noise from now on. He's just been presented with a new bell by the mayor. Alfie Howard, who gets around the borough on a moped wearing a 3-cornered crash helmet, had his last bell stolen. Now Alfie's all set to carry on crying. Well, that's it for tonight. Next news in breakfast time. But now here's the weather from Mike Fish.
Good evening to you. Well, once again, just about an east-west split across the country. Well done, Butt of Lewis there. You just about managed to get up to normal today. And congratulations, Penzance, unbroken sunshine. Mind you, over in the east, things were very different. Skegness living up to its bracing image, all the snow showers you had, making it the wettest place, and poor old Anvil Green only just about struggled over freezing. And indeed, it's going to be another pretty cold day tomorrow in most parts of the country. The high pressure still there, these northeasterly winds continuing to blow and bring us some further snow showers. But in the north, it's going to be a little bit different. That weak warm front has introduced somewhat less cold weather. Now, if we look back at the satellite picture this time yesterday, a couple of things to keep your eye on. I'll be running the sequence in a minute. First of all, the lump of cloud to the north and the other area of cloud over the continent. You can see that a sort of squeeze took place. This lump of cloud tried to come up towards us. Thankfully it didn't, because there's a lot of snow coming out of that cloud. It just about brushed the extreme southeastern corner and is now, I think, going to slip away into France. But the thicker cloud has made it down into Scotland, and indeed it's brought with it some outbreaks of rain and even places some sleet, and over the hills some snow too. Still some snow showers to come in the extreme southeast there, some in the Channel Islands as well, the odd one actually in the Isles of Scilly, at least in the next hour or so. Now, during the course of the night, that thicker cloud's going to work its way down across the rest of Scotland, or at least most of Scotland, into Northern Ireland, bringing those outbreaks of rain and sleet with it. Before that, temperatures dropping below freezing, but rising again later on in the night, but once again, a widespread frost over most parts of England and Wales. Now, tomorrow, the north and west of Scotland, Northern Ireland, starting off cloudy, that rain and sleet scattered about, and during the course of the day, that thicker cloud is going to work its way into the rest of Scotland, perhaps also into northern parts of England and Wales, bringing along a spot or two of rain with it. But the rain further west tending to fizzle out probably as the day goes on. Those snow showers right from the word go in the extreme southeast, and like the last few days, they'll begin to filter westwards as the day goes on. Quite cold again in most parts of the country, particularly so in the southeastern corner, as it has been the last few days. Good night to you.
In 1969, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. Nazi scientists built the rocket that put him there. America had been deceived by a Pentagon plot to recruit known war criminals.
A century after slavery had been abolished, German scientists had resorted to barbarism to realize their dreams. At least 20,000 inmates died of starvation, fatigue, illness, and outright murder. The survivors dug the tunnels and built the rockets.
For them, we were rubbish. Nothing. Slaves.
Oh, no. No. I had nothing to do with ordering the hangings.
The defendants in the dock are charged with murder. But this is no mere murder trial.
Well, what's the use of bringing that up? You can only run into trouble. Let sleeping dogs lie.
We weren't looking for Nazis. We were looking for the rocket scientists.
The Paperclip Conspiracy, Friday at 10:20 on BBC1.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Now, did you ever feel that you were only a hiccup in creation? Well, so did Kenny Everett until he met John Westbrook in QED.